Hey guys, it's Bella. Welcome back to my channel. I hope you guys are all having a wonderful day. I hope your week is off to a great start. In today's video, we are going to be covering another Mystery Monday case, and this is probably the most requested case I've ever had on my channel. I've been seeing it in the comments for years, and I have been wanting to do a video on this case for years. I want to talk to you about it. I want to hear your thoughts, your opinions, but every time I started trying to put it into video format, I got really overwhelmed because it is such a huge case. I don't want to miss anything, and I just felt like I wasn't doing it justice, but today is the day. We're going to be talking about the Bain family murders. This case took place in 1995, and there are still a lot of questions today about what really happened and who really killed the Bain family, but there are some very strong opinions about what happened and who did it. So very curious to see your thoughts in the comments. Before we do get into it, I just quickly want to thank today's sponsor, NordVPN. Seriously, if you guys don't have NordVPN by now, you need to get on it. I promise you, it is the best thing. I've been using it for years now, and even before that, Kerry had been pestering me to get it, to sign up. I gotta give him credit. He would always tell me, you gotta get NordVPN, you gotta get NordVPN, and I just kept putting it off and off and off. And then finally, once I signed up, I was like, hello, why did this take me so long? I watch a lot of international shows, and I hate even being like a day behind because then I get spoilers and it just ruins the whole thing. Like Married at First Sight, the Australian one started like a week before we moved to London, and they actually do air the Australian maths over here in London, but it starts after it's already finished in Australia. So I would use my VPN to take me back to Australia so I could watch it in real time rather than like 4 months later when they decided to air it over here. Oh my god, and don't even get me started on public Wi-Fi. I'm like actually scared of public Wi-Fi. I used to spend so much money on international roaming when I would travel so that I wouldn't have to use the sketchy airport Wi-Fi when I arrived in another country, or like when I would go and work at a cafe, I never wanted to use the sketchy cafe Wi-Fi, so I would always hotspot and use up all of my data. But now I'm on NordVPN, so I don't even have to think twice about it. NordVPN protects you online, which is so important nowadays. It protects and encrypts all of your online traffic and online data, and it is just genuinely the best thing. You will not regret getting it. And you can also get an exclusive NordVPN deal if you use my link, which is nordvpn.com/bellafiore, and you will get extra subscription time with that. And they also have a 30-day money back guarantee, so it is totally risk-free. Definitely check it out. I will leave all of the information and that link in the description box down below for you. So like I said, today we're going to be talking about the Bain family murders, and the Bain family was from Dunedin, which is in New Zealand, and it's a beautiful place. Like, it actually looks unreal, and back when this case took place in 1994, they had a population of less than 100,000 people, so it's not tiny, but it's not a huge city either. The Bain family consisted of father Robin Bain and mother Margaret Cullen, and they met while attending the Presbyterian church and hit off right away. They got married in 1969, and Robin was 33 at the time and Margaret was 25, and they both came from pretty big families, so they were really excited to start their own big family and have, you know, lots of babies together. They had their first child on the 27th of March in 1972, a son named David. And then 2 years after David's birth, the family moved from New Zealand to Gorlam in Papua New Guinea, it's like a pretty rural little island off the east coast of Papua New Guinea. And while they were there, Robin worked at the Teachers Training College and Margaret studied anthropology. During their time in Gorlam, they also had 2 more children, both daughters. Their daughter Arawa was born in 1975, and Laniette was born in 1976. Then 6 years after living in Gorlam, the family relocated to Port Moresby, which is the capital city of Papua New Guinea, so it was on the main island. They lived in a compound there, and Robin worked at a school within that compound offering short refresher courses for adults. And it was there in 1980 that Margaret gave birth to their 4th and final child, a son named Stephen. As the Bain family raised their family in Papua New Guinea, they really embraced the local lifestyle and and they immersed themselves and their children in the local culture. Their house was full of traditional artifacts and elements, and their house was also known to be very chaotic. It was said that the family lived a pretty free-spirited lifestyle, and they were kind of known to be a little bit odd. Margaret apparently didn't lift a finger at the house, and the kids were always running around naked. There weren't really a lot of rules, and it was described as being a bit of a madhouse and a bit feral. It actually reached a point where Margaret was concerned about the well-being of her family because of the way that they lived, and she approached a psychologist who assessed each member of the family, and this psychologist described David as being looking at you in an odd way without expression. And then he said about the father, Robin, that there wasn't an ounce of emotion in him. He was completely disempowered. Neighbors who knew the family described Margaret as being friendly, fun, she was always laughing, and they described Robin as being more earnest and more reserved than his wife. And he also wanted another child, a fifth child, but Margaret didn't. 4 was enough for her. And she was also kind of known as being the dominant partner in the marriage, whereas Robin was super dedicated to his family, and he pretty much just went along with whatever made Margaret happy. Eventually in 1988, after 15 years of living as missionaries in Papua New Guinea, the Bain family decided to move back to Dunedin in New Zealand to their family home that they had there, and it was in pretty bad condition. I mean, it wasn't looking good when they left 15 years earlier, so 15 years later it was obviously even worse, but after spending, all that time in a developing country, it didn't really bother them the way that it looked. By this point as well, their children were pretty much all teenagers. So David was around 16 at this point, Arawa was 14, Laniette was 12, and Stephen was 10. So they were not used to New Zealand. They had grown up in Papua New Guinea. So moving back to New Zealand, they were just not used to it. Like, the education system specifically was a massive culture shock for them. They were young though, so they were able to kind of eventually settle in. They really got into theatre and music, and through that they were able to feel a sense of belonging. Robin, however, did not settle in as easily. He was now 58. He really struggled to find a regular job back in Dunedin, so he ended up taking the only job offer available to him, which was to be the principal of Tairi Primary School, which was about 50 kilometers away from where they lived, and it was a really small school too. There was only 2 teachers, so it was quite a step down for him, and it was also a huge commute. 50 kilometers each way every single day is a huge commitment, but it was a job, and he had a wife and a bunch of kids to feed and look after and take care of, so he wanted to make the most of it. 50-year-old Margaret was not working when they got back to Dunedin. She looked after the house and the kids, and I think she was still living in and fostering this chaotic home environment that they had back in Papua New Guinea. She loved going to garage sales. She loved going to garage sales, and she would take home all of these random things all of the time because she was a bit of a hoarder. So the house was always a mess, it was always untidy, and she would also stack bottles of fruit around the house because she was obsessed with bottling fruits. I don't know. She also became really interested in New Age spiritualism, and she believed that she needed to protect her family from evil spirits, and one of these evil spirits was her husband Robin, and she believed that Robin was the devil incarnate. She referred to him as Belial, and Belial is basically a biblical name for the devil. So she was always calling him Belial, one of the 4 crown princes of hell, and I believe at one point she even tried to perform an exorcism on him. She also had a diary where she ranked her family members in order of who was the most possessed. So obviously Robin was the most possessed, and he was closely followed by Laniette, and then David was the least possessed of her family members. She also began writing obsessively in her diary, and she stopped doing anything around the house. She stopped interacting with her family for the most part, and they had this caravan in their backyard, and she would just go and lock herself in this caravan, and she would just write in her diary. she would write about all of her feelings, about how she felt about all of her family members, and from her diary it was so clear that she favored David. She obviously did not like Robin because she thought he was the devil, and she was obviously saying these things to him. You know, she was calling him the devil, she was trying to give him exorcisms, and so Laniette would often stick up for her dad and be like, hey, cut it out, this is not nice, this is not cool, he is not the devil. And so she didn't like Laniette because she often stood up for her father. Obviously, it was just not normal behavior, and so Robin was really concerned. He actually ended up reaching out to a close family friend from Papua New Guinea, and this family friend flew over to New Zealand to speak to Margaret, and she was just immediately concerned as well by her behavior. By this point, Margaret was saying things like she believed that in a previous incarnation of herself, she had a relationship or a connection with Winston Churchill. And she was also saying that she believed that she had a really deep connection with this family friend from Papua New Guinea. So she was saying she believed she had like a sisterly or a mother-daughter, sister-sister relationship with her in a previous life. And it was to a point where this family friend believed that she had just totally lost her mind. Eventually, Margaret did start living back in the main family home rather than staying in the caravan in the backyard, but things were still so far from normal. By 1994, her and Robin were estranged, and she actually banished Robin from the house. So he was spending most nights in an old schoolhouse in Tairi, or he was living in his car, and he would come home to the family home on weekends and Monday nights, and when he would be at the family home, he would have to stay in the caravan in the backyard. Or in the garden, sorry. Also, allegedly at this time, Margaret told an acquaintance that she would shoot Robin if she could. So it was like well-known sort of information that they were having marital problems. Margaret was also writing in her diary at this time about how disconnected she felt from her family and how she felt like she had lost control over them. And so in an attempt to gain control over her family again, she came up with this elaborate plan of building this new house. So she wanted to demolish the house that they were currently living in. It was overcrowded. You know, she had collected and hoarded so much stuff that it was now spilling out of the house. It was just in shambles. So she wanted to knock the whole thing down and build this big retreat where strangers could come and stay as well, and they could all speak to God together. She planned this whole thing with David, and he was really there for her through and through throughout this whole process. He helped her plan, helped her do up drawings, he helped kind of clean up the garden and prep the garden for this big project, and he was just really there for his mum. He really supported her, and the same could not be said about his feelings towards his dad. He and Robin had a pretty tumultuous relationship. I think because Robin wasn't in the house for most of the week because Margaret had banished him, David felt like he had to step up and be the man of the house. So he and Robin always had this kind of power struggle. You know, Robin was the dad, but David almost wanted to take over Robin's role. And what is so strange about this too is that while all of this is going on, Robin is still funding the entire family. Margaret is not working, so he is still funding Margaret, he's funding all of the kids, like he is paying for everything for them and supporting all of them. He goes to work every day, he puts all of the money into a joint account which they can access, or Margaret at least can access and pay for their lifestyle. Anyway, by 1994, David was 22, he was living at home and he was delivering newspapers, and he was also collecting welfare, which he would then give that money to his family. He had always loved music and joined a men's choir, and he also enrolled in university to study zoology with the goal of becoming a vet, but he dropped out pretty soon after enrolling, instead went to work at Opera Live for a while, and then eventually decided to go back to university to study classical music with the goal of becoming an opera singer. And all of his classmates at university described him as a funny guy. They said he had a good sense of humor, and he was just the type of person that always took jokes on the chin. Arawa was 19 at the time, and she was living at the family home studying to be a teacher. She was a really smart girl. She was also pretty popular at school. She had a lot of friends, and she was also head girl of the school. But she told some of her friends that David was overbearing and controlling and just kept tabs on all of her movements. And because of this, she avoided making plans with friends because he would just like come along to her plans. Like he would just invite himself and come along. And he also owned a gun, and Arawa apparently told one of her friends that he had threatened to shoot some of his family members. Laniette Laniat was 18 years old at this time, and she was the only family member not living at home. She was living in a flat in Russell Street and occasionally stayed with her father in Tyre. She was also working as a sex worker, which is something she didn't want her parents to know about, but eventually she got a job at a cafe and was hoping to straighten out her life. And then Stephen was 14 years old, so he was still living at home, obviously. He was still in school, and because he was so young, Margaret really tried to keep him close. He really craved approval from his father, but obviously Robin had been banished from the house, so he didn't get to see his dad all that much, except for when he was at home on weekends and Monday nights. And because Stephen was so young, he didn't have the option to just go and stay with his dad like Laniette did. So David kind of tried to step in and act as sort of a father figure to Stephen, which he kind of tried to do for all of the kids in the Bain family household, right? Like every single one of them, he tried to act like a father figure, and they all just thought it was really weird, and it caused a lot of tension in the household. And there was already so much tension. Like the household was pretty much divided. It was a split between those who were on Robin's side and those who were on Margaret's side. Obviously David was on Margaret's side and Laniette was on Robin's side, and then Stephen and Arawa kind of sat somewhere in the middle. So on Sunday the 19th of June in 1994, Laniette came home for the Sunday night. She had told some of her friends that she was going home for a family meeting and that she was going to set some things straight with her family. So everybody was home on that Sunday night. Laniette had obviously come home. Robin was home for the weekend. So Sunday night, the whole Bain family was in the family home. And the next morning on Monday the 20th of June at 7:09 a.m., emergency services received a phone call from David Bain, and he was frantically saying, "Help, they're all dead, they're all dead."
Help you. No, they're all dead. What's the matter? They're all dead. I came home and they're all dead. Whereabouts are you? Every street. Oh, every street? 65 every street. They're all dead. Who's all dead? My family, they're all dead. Hurry up. It's okay. Every street that runs off Somerville Street? Yes. What number are you calling from? 454 2527. 454 2527. 2527. And your last name? Bain. Bain. Okay. We're on our way. Okay, Mr. Bain? Yeah, we'll be there very shortly.
Police arrive shortly after 7:30 a.m. and when they arrive, David refused to let them in the front door, so they ended up having to break the front door down to get into the house. And when they got inside, they found David in a catatonic state, and he pointed towards the living room. So they walked to the living room, and that is where police find the body of 58-year-old Robin Bain. Next to him was David's .22 caliber rifle. It had 2 magazine rounds inside it. Its silencer was there, and then there was another magazine with 3 more rounds. Also inside the living room was the family computer, and it was on, and it had a typed message on it which said, "Sorry, you are the only one who deserved to stay." As officers made their way through the rest of the house, they found the body of 50-year-old Margaret lying in her bed in her own bedroom, and then they found the body of 18-year-old Laniette in her own bed in her own bedroom. They had both been shot in the head, and it was potentially done in their sleep. The body of 19-year-old Arawa was found kneeling, so it looked like she had maybe tried to make a final plea for her life before also being shot in the head. 14-year-old Stephen had also been killed in the same manner as the rest of his family, but his body wasn't discovered right away because his bedroom was kind of located behind a curtain in Margaret's room, so officers didn't actually realize that there was a bedroom behind there, so his body wasn't discovered until a while later. But when it was discovered, he was found lying on the floor, having been shot in the head, and it looked like he did put up a fight. An investigation into the murders began immediately, and before we do talk about the investigation, I just want to make clear that there is a lot of information out there on this case and on this investigation, so I wasn't able to include every single little detail, otherwise this video would be literally 10 parts long. There are a lot of conflicting reports. A lot of things went wrong in the investigation. So, you know, there are some things that I may not mention, and I could only go into so much detail. But if there is anything that you think I've missed, anything that you think is important, please leave it down in the comments below. But I have tried my best to consider all public information. So all of the Bains, besides David, had been shot in the head, and the rifle that was used was found lying next to Robin. So the first impression upon looking at the crime scene is that it was a murder-suicide, and that Robin had murdered the entire family and then shot himself in the head. David supported this theory as well, but he obviously couldn't be ruled out as a suspect. He went and stayed with Margaret's sister and her husband after the murders took place for a few days, and a bunch of family came over to support him while the funerals were arranged as well. He was obviously questioned extensively about the murders as well. As the only surviving member of the family, he was the only one who could recount what had happened in the lead up to the murders. He was the only one who could provide any insight at all as to what happened. So I'm going to talk about his story and his recollection of events that took place up until the murders. He provided some of this information in his initial interviews with police, and then some of the information a bit later after he had gone through therapy, which helped him kind of remember some other things that had happened. So I'm just going to consolidate all of that. So David said that after Lanier got to the family home on Sunday night, that he went with Lanier to go and get some, you know, hot chips from a store, and he brought them back and they all ate them for dinner with some fish that Margaret had prepared in the microwave. At some point there was a disagreement between David and Robin, because David had said that he wanted to use the chainsaw the next morning and Robin said no, and it was just one of those things where David saw himself as the man of the house, but obviously Robin was his father. So they always had these kind of little disagreements in a way to, I guess, assert their dominance or like fight for power. David said that around 9:30 p.m. that night, he went to bed while the rest of the family stayed up and watched TV together. And then sometime just before midnight, a car left the house to go to the nearest ATM to put some money onto the credit card, which is not unusual. Like either Robin or Margaret would often do this just before midnight, go and put some money on the credit card to avoid any extra interest charges. The next day, David said that he woke up at his usual time of 5:30 a.m. and he left the house with his dog at 5:45 a.m. to go and do his newspaper route. And he checked his watch often on this route, and when it reached 6:40, he walked up the hill to back to his house. And this walk up the hill took 2 minutes, so he was home by 6:42 a.m. In his initial interview with police, he claimed that when he got home, there was no newspaper out front of the house, which meant that Robin was awake. He had gone from the caravan, collected the newspaper on his way into the home. David also made note that when he got into the home, he noticed that the light was on in his mum's bedroom, so he assumed that meant she was already awake. So he claims that when he got home, he went straight to his room, he didn't even turn the lights on, he took his shoes off, he put his bag down from his newspaper route, and he took his Walkman off and put that in the bed. And then he went down to the laundry room where he washed all of the black ink off of his hand from the newspapers, and he also did a load of washing, including a red jumper that he had worn on his newspaper routes for that week. After that, he said he went back to his bedroom, and that is when he noticed his rifle's trigger lock and some bullets on the floor of his bedroom. And his first instinct was to run to his mum to make sure she was okay. And that is when he found her shot and killed in her bed. After that, he went through the house room by room and found that every single one of his family members had also been shot and killed. He heard a gurgling noise from Laniette, and she was just barely clinging on to life. He then runs to the caravan to go and check on his dad, and on his way to the front door, he passes through the living room, and that is where he finds his dad's body. The rifle is lying next to him, and the computer is on with that suicide note typed on it. Now, a major red flag that presented itself really early on in the investigation is the difficulty in which Robin would have with shooting himself in the head with this rifle, because obviously a rifle is long, and the angle in which the bullet entered his head, it just didn't make sense for him to have held the rifle and shot himself in that sort of angle. Like, it was very unlikely that he would have been able to do that himself. There was also evidence to suggest that his head had actually moved shortly after his death due to the way that the blood leaked out of the gunshot wound. The computer was allegedly turned on at 6:44 a.m. as well, which would have given David enough time to come home, turn the computer on, write the suicide note himself, and then shoot Robin. David also had injuries on his forehead, he had scrapes on his knee and on his chest, and his knuckles were also really red, and none of these injuries could be explained by David. Police were under the impression that these injuries were actually caused during a struggle with Stephen, and this was also strengthened by the fact that Stephen's blood was found on David's clothes that he was wearing when police first showed up to the house. They also found David's leather theater gloves in Stephen's room, which had Stephen's blood on them, as well as a singular glass lens, and then in David's room, they found a pair of glasses that was missing one of the lenses. More blood was found on the top of David's socks, and there was bloody sock prints found in Margaret's room with a trail leading to Laniette's room. Initially, David claimed that he found his mother with her eyes still open. However, when police arrived at the house and discovered her body, her eyes were closed. They also found a shell casing near the computer, and Robin's body was found on the other side of the room. So this suggests that he did not shoot himself, because obviously he cannot shoot himself from the other side of the room. David also told investigators that he was the only one who knew where the spare key was to get into the trigger lock where his rifle was kept. They also queried the way in which Robin allegedly killed his whole family and then killed himself, because why would he spare David and leave this note saying he's the only one who deserved to stay, yet implicate him so heavily by using his gun and using his theater gloves? And why would he keep David alive and think he's the only one who deserves to stay when they often fought and had this power struggle, and David was so frequently on Margaret's side through all the family troubles? So obviously cracks are starting to form in David's story, and there was just a severe lack of evidence to suggest that Robin was the killer. Not to mention David's timeline of when he got home to when he called the police just doesn't really make sense. He claims he got home at 6:42 a.m., but then he didn't call the police until 7:09 a.m. So that's more than 20 minutes where he could have been doing anything, and he told the police that he couldn't provide the police with a recollection of what happened during that time. So obviously things are not looking good for David at this point. From an investigator's perspective, he is looking really sketchy, and they have all of this circumstantial evidence against him. But to top things off, they then retrieve four of David's bloody fingerprints on the rifle. They also find a palm print, Stephen's palm print on the silencer, which, there was allegedly a struggle between Stephen and the killer, and they are theorizing that Stephen had kind of grabbed the silencer in an attempt to push the gun away. To make things even worse for David, when investigators first got to the house, there was no blood on David's hands, but there was blood on the phone that he used to call emergency services. Obviously, in his initial story to police, he said that he went to the laundry and he washed his hands to try and get all of the black ink from the newspapers off. However, in the laundry, they found blood smears on the washing machine and on the detergent box, and they also found a drop of blood in the washing basin. There was also a green sweater in the load of washing that David did when he first got home, and he claimed originally that this sweater belonged to Arawa, but then he changed his story and said that it belonged to Robin. And fibers from this green sweater were actually found underneath Stephen's fingernails, and this sweater also rubbed up blood against walls in the house, presumably during the struggle when the murders took place. Allegedly, a week before the shootings took place, Margaret had told a friend that she was concerned about David's well-being and that he was having dark premonitions and hallucinations, and apparently she was really not on board with how overbearing he was being of his siblings. She believed that this should have been left up to Robin. So obviously, with all of this evidence having been discovered, David was arrested 4 days after the murders took place, and during his time in custody, he was having fits and blackouts, and police believed that he was faking this behavior. Just over 2 weeks after the murders took place, on the 5th of July, the New Zealand Fire Service was actually instructed by the trustees of the Bain Family Trust to burn down the Bain family home where the murders took place, which is obviously just far too soon after these murders took place. Supposedly it was done to prevent someone breaking in and like burning it down out of anger. I don't know why somebody would do that, but it really hindered the case and it destroyed a lot of evidence, which we will touch more on a bit later. David's trial began on the 8th of May in 1995, and I hate to do this to you guys, but I'm going to be talking about that and everything else we haven't touched on in part 2. I promise I'm going to be uploading part 2 this time tomorrow, so you don't have to wait very long. But it gets even crazier. Like, you would think we've already unpacked most of the information in this case, but David's trial is really where things start to go down a rabbit hole and it gets even crazier. So I will see you guys in part 2. I want to hear all of your thoughts on what you think so far in the comments. I'll be here to chat. But that is everything from me today. That's all for part 1 of this case, and hopefully I will see you guys in part 2 tomorrow. Bye guys.